And I'm pleased to be with you all today to talk about transforming behavioral health care and how to implement feedback-informed services into your agency or treatment setting. I have a bunch of slides to show. All of these slides are available on my personal website. That's at scottdmiller.com. You have to have the D in between Scott and Miller, or you're going to end up at another guy's website who's also named Scott Miller, who's a very nice guy, but it's not me. He's actually a Nashville bluegrass musician. He does a really great music, but it's just not me. ScottDMiller.com. Scroll down to the fourth bullet point there, scholarly publications and handouts, and you'll be able to access these particular slides. I want to also mention that our website, the Center for Clinical Excellence, this is the largest organization dedicated to excellence in the field of behavioral health. Membership is actually completely free. We're also ad-free, no plugs for books or come-ons for workshops. It's just a place where clinicians can meet and greet. The idea here is similar to what I'll be talking about momentarily when it comes to implementation. I have the megaphone, so to speak, for the next few minutes, but we find as we travel around that there is so much expertise located locally that rarely gets access and rarely gets attention. So I hope you'll join us and the thousands of other people that are meeting daily to talk and share their experiences with feedback-informed treatment ideas. I'm gathering if you're on the phone call today, then you are dealing with many of the same challenges the age and Canada last week. Tomorrow I leave and I go to Newport Beach, and at each of these places I'm talking with clinicians and agency managers, and I'm hearing them talk about the changing environment in which they practice. Outcome, evidence, effectiveness, accountability, these are the watchwords of the day. Everybody's being asked to put up or shut up as regards the research evidence, and if they can't show that what they do works, well, then the funding spigot is turned off, so to speak. It's easy, I think, to feel picked on in mental health, but I want you all to know that this is part of a worldwide trend. It's not specific to mental health whatsoever. It's true in medicine, it's true in investing increasingly, and it's true in many other fields. Neither is it specific to our commercial healthcare system. I was in Canada, as I said last week, and their single-payer system is also undergoing dramatic changes with mental health under the thumb of funders asking, can you show us what you do works? There are many other trends along the way that I know may be giving you headaches. There is a move from inpatient to outpatient and from hospital to the community. There are shortened lengths of intensive treatment, increased utilization, and performance reviews. And of course, there are the declining reimbursement rates. And at the same time, it's not as if the systems are sitting idly by. They are asking us to assume more accountability, more responsibility, even risk in terms of payment. There's been a professionalization of services, whether it's in substance abuse, in case management. All settings are requiring that there be more training in order to merit funding for their particular program. And additionally, there's an expansion of treatment options and modalities that are frequently mandated by licensing authorities or regulatory bodies in the states in which people are practicing. All of that standardization at the same time that clinicians and agencies are being told that they have to deliver individualized, clinically driven, and in many cases recovery-oriented treatment. So what do we do? Where do we go? How do we survive in that particular world in which we're living increasingly? And so let me talk a little bit about what we think is a fundamental shift that needs to take place in order for clinicians to survive and thrive, and for agencies to implement feedback-informed work in their setting. There has been a traditional model that's guided practice, and that model is asked based on a question that was first asked by Paul in the late 1960s, who said, we need to know what treatment by whom is most effective for this person with that problem under which set of circumstances, and how does it come about. Many of the trends that I highlighted earlier are reflected in this traditional model. And again, the result is clinicians feeling overwhelmed, spending as much as 30% of their available time at the office completing documentation and regulatory requirements. We're suggesting that in order to implement feedback-informed work, there needs to be a fundamental shift at the paradigm level governing clinical practice. Personally, I see movement in a variety of settings in states that suggest that this is taking place. It's not there completely, but certainly implementing in your setting can make a big difference in terms of how quickly this new perspective is adopted. And that is to shift to what's called the contextual model. In the contextual model, we realize that factors far outside the individual being treated and their diagnosis and the treatment approach impact treatment outcome. We know, for example, from the research literature that there are 3 factors that affect outcome at least. Number 1 is what the clinician does. That includes diagnosis and the particular treatment approach, and the client. Number 2, however, and actually exerting a greater influence on outcome, is where the treatment is delivered. 2 to 3% of the variance is attributable to that factor alone. And then finally, who delivers the treatment is about 8 to 9 times more important than what treatment is delivered. So in a contextual model, the emphasis shifts from delivering the appropriate treatment per se, or for a given diagnosis, for which there's lots of paperwork to indicate that that's what we've done, to assessing whether or not this relationship between this consumer and provider or program or level of care is working at this point in time. A host of feedback studies now indicate that when clients use very simple scales, like the ORS and the SRS, then provide feedback to the agency and the provider of services, that outcomes and engagement actually improve, and fairly significantly. This is really the old news. Of course, in trying to implement, many people found that the promises of this kind of service were much more easier to hear and tell the staff to do than it was actually able to get them to do when they tried to implement it in their particular setting. Of course, as in most endeavors, the devil is in the details. So how do you move from a great idea? We should be measuring the work we do with clients. We should be having the clients give us feedback. When they give us feedback, we end up with better outcomes and more engagement of the particular clients. And that data, in turn, can be used by agencies to send to funders and say, we are meeting our objectives. And finally, something that is of personal interest to me is we can also use that data to highlight how we as a profession can do better. Clinicians can be pushed to the edge of their current realm of reliable performance and encouraged to take the next step so that they're continuously improving over the course of their professional careers. How can we get those good ideas to happen? Well, again, many agencies have found that it's a lot easier said than done. In implementation efforts around the country, the research evidence indicates that many people struggle following their initial enthusiasm for the ideas. A recent study by De Jong out of the Netherlands found that the effective feedback really didn't depend as much on the measure that was being used or the nature of the feedback, but the environment in which the clinician was working and the readiness of the individual clinician to use that to inform care. What this means is that, again, it's not simply about the measures, but if you're on the call, you've probably already realized that. So how do you change systems? How do you get from here to there? And we have found that implementing feedback-informed work, whether you're using the measures that I developed, the ORS and the SRS, which, by the way, if you haven't gotten them, you can go to my website and get them for free. Or you're using some other well-designed measure, for example, the OQ45, which is what I started with back in the 90s. it's going to affect a variety of realms in your particular organization. What realms are those? Well, it will affect the clinical. As I already said, we have emerging evidence that suggests that it's not necessarily about the measures, it may be about the therapists. It's going to make demands on your administration and management, supervisors. There will be needed changes in information, documentation, and IT. Regulatory and accreditation may also be, in some instances, in conflict, although both JCAHO and CARF here in the United States have been highly supportive of feedback-informed work. Some state regulations have proven complicated when adopting the measures. Consumers, those folks who use our service, also have an important voice in this process. They will be affected by being asked to give feedback. And finally, funders. These are the realms that are likely to be affected. And so, if you're an agency manager or director, I think the temptation is to think in some ways that if we send the staff to training, get them training, hire the best trainer, that they should be able to come home and implement these ideas. Oh, were it that simple. Turns out there needs to be, in most instances, a great deal of thinking prior to training. And we've developed a very brief gap assessment tool that is listed at the top of this particular picture called the FRIFM, the Feedback Readiness Inventory and Fidelity Measure. That's a mouthful. FRIFM is what we call it in short. You can access this particular document on my website and also in the document section for the International Center for Clinical Excellence. This document was created by myself, David Mealy, and Bill Plum as part of an application to have the measures considered an evidence-based practice. And it goes through each of the domains and asks questions to help administrators and management sort through just how ready are we to implement feedback-informed work in our particular setting. So, clinical, there are a series of questions, about 20 of them, that you rate on a scale from 1 to 5. Same for administrative, information, documentation, IT, regulatory, consumers, and funders. Each question helps us identify how we can operationalize use of feedback in our particular setting and how close we are to being able to realize full operation. Summing up the numbers can give you a very quick idea. Oh, sorry about that, gang. Forgot to unplug my other phone. Can give you a very quick idea of just how close you are. If your scores are trending at a 4 or lower, then the chances are that you are not ready and you need to do the pre-work as indicated by the particular items on the FRIFM. Well, I encourage you to get that and start to fill it out. And as you're filling that out, you can then peruse the research by Fixon and Rogers, which we cover in detail, by the way, in manual number 6, the ICCE Feedback Informed Treatment and Training Manual on Implementation. That is also accessible on my website, and I also know that My Outcomes is working to create an entire e-learning platform based on these manuals that will be available to clinicians who are using their particular system. So you'll be able to get a full course of instruction on these particular steps. Fixon and Rogers identify 5 basic steps, and their research shows the more time that you put into planning each of these stages before you get that initial training, the more likely your implementation effort will be successful. There's nothing magical here, no great revelations. It's mostly about taking the time that's needed to plan this out before launching. 5 stages. Exploration. During the exploration phase, you're asking, are these the right measures for our particular context? That may mean having to go back and look for different measures. Step 2, and we'll go through each of these during the webinar in a bit more detail. Installation. That's where you have training, your first initial training, and you start putting the structures in place to carry on feedback-informed work. You have your initial implementation phase. That's where you're piloting the measurement tools. I'll talk about this in more detail, but let me just underscore, piloting is crucial to help work out the kinks as you implement these ideas across a variety of providers and different kinds of services. Number 4 is full implementation, creating a new norm. In essence, after this, you've had all your training, you've fully implemented, you've worked out the kinks, and feedback-informed care becomes the new agency norm. And then last but not least, sustainability, a plan for keeping the process going. I can tell you that when I first started doing feedback-informed work nearly a decade ago, or a little over a decade ago, that I was telling people, much to the consternation of some, that you could probably expect implementation to take at least 3 years. But the truth of the matter is that in most settings, full implementation takes longer, about twice as long. And there are significant bumps along the way that can be addressed if we plan this process carefully. So let's look at each of the stages in detail. Exploration. If you're thinking about using the ORS and the SRS like many other agencies are around the world, the first key during that exploration phase, and you form an initial implementation team made up of some managers and supervisors and line staff, a consumer representative, and you ask yourself, are these the right measures for our context? That initial implementation team explores the impact of the new intervention on each domain identified by the FRI-FM. What's it going to mean that you are doing feedback-informed work in those 6 domains? During this phase, you can also consult with other agencies and even hire a consultant to come in and talk with you about it. Here, the ICCE community can be a boon. There are literally hundreds of managers and representatives, individual practitioners that are using the measures in different service settings. You can go on the website 24 hours a day and post your question. And sometimes I think, what do these people do for work? Because generally you can expect an answer very, very quickly. Exploration is, as the name implies, you're really thinking about whether to use this particular measure. Perhaps you've seen me or someone else in a workshop, and this seems to be a solution for a question that you've been wondering about. Take time to explore the process. Next piece is installation. This is your costliest stage. Part of it is developing a budget and ensuring that you have management support. I can tell you that the implementation efforts that I've been involved with that have failed, and I have been involved with ones that have failed, or that I have heard about and consulted on that have failed, have been those where there's been a lack of administrative or management support. Let me give you an idea about how you'll know you'll have management support. The administrator and chief executive officer shows up at the training. If they're not there, staff quickly get the idea that this is a quote-unquote clinical training, and it doesn't have much to do with the overall organization, and more problematically, that management, as soon as they get a new idea, may not support the current ideas to full implementation. You're going to put training, supervision, and supportive structures in place. In manual number 6 in the feedback-informed treatment manuals, we've laid out exactly what kind of training events, supervision, and supportive structures need to be in place. Let me just give you one example that we wrote about in an article in the May-June issue of the Psychotherapy Networker called The Road to Mastery, based on our work with an organization headed by an award-winning administrator named Robbie Babbins-Wagner. Robbie sets aside time every other week for her staff to sit down, look at graphs, and discuss those graphs with a consultant. This has resulted in, of course, some expense, not only in paying the consultant, but also setting aside the time where the staff can really learn how to use the measures and interpret what the measures mean for their ongoing clinical practice. That is, in addition, by the way, to making sure that every single progress note has an outcome focus. We created a set of notes that exemplars that could be used for agencies when developing a feedback-informed progress note as part of our application to SAMHSA for consideration of the ORS and SRS as an evidence-based practice. Once again, those basic forms are available on the ICCE. You've got to train your supervisors. Supervisors are key. If they're not on board, and they don't understand how to use the measures, they're not expected to use them, the chances of failure are significantly increased. During the installation phase, most agencies have to change or adjust their productivity standards. You're going to be in a period of learning, and staff will need extra time to think through, reflect, strategize, look at the graphs, and plan. That requires that they not be held to the same standards as folks outside the pilot project, which is one of the other items during the installation phase. You run some small pilots in various groups to see how does this play out. Let me give you one hint about pilot projects. You want to make sure that you're including all people, including the ones that are likely to be critical. It's their feedback that will give us the clues we need to adjust it to fit our particular setting. And then you're going to create what we call a TOG, or a Transition Oversight Group. This is a group, again, made up of an administrator, supervisors, and some line staff that are going to field the feedback from the small pilot projects that you're running. Their job is to monitor how the measures are being used and the difficulties, and then to develop policy statements and solutions to the problems that arise. Those solutions are sent to the lead administrator, who then either approves or suggests that changes be made to the revision of the policy or standard. That is the installation phase. This phase can take anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half. I've seen it take as long as 2 years, depending on the size of the agency. Initial implementation is the next phase. Here, you've run your small pilot projects, and your findings are used to put policy and support structures into place. There will have to be changes in policies. For example, what is the policy for dealing with clients who the agency simply doesn't help? Creating what we've called a continuum of care. Where will the clients go when what we have to offer doesn't seem to help them? At this point, you're also going to be implementing across programs and the entire agency. And during that time, you're going to have to continue training. You're bringing lots and lots of other people on board. And steps at this point need to be taken to ensure fidelity and use of the real-time data that are generated by the measures. During this time, you can use the FRIFM as a measure of progress, having both management and staff complete this during various phases of the initial implementation stage, to see, are we making the progress that we need to make in terms of our implementation. Step 4 is a full implementation. When might you be expected to experience this stage? Well, if you listen to what Fixon has to say, and I highly recommend his research. If you just Google Dean Fixon, you'll be able to find a host of manuals and studies that cite his work. Full implementation takes anywhere from 3 to 7 years. And certainly in the groups that I'm have been interacting with, and that I hear other consultants for the ICCE interact with, 7 years sounds about right. Now, that doesn't mean you won't be on your way, but full implementation really is a big endeavor. And what's critical is that you support it through each stage. Why? Well, because this will not be the only system change effort that takes place during the time that you're implementing FIT. During full implementation, you have continued performance monitoring at both the individual and organizational levels. Here again, the FRIFM can be helpful. You're also using the outcome data generated by the feedback system for professional development initiatives. You're going to be able to identify, while using the measures, programs that fall short of agency norms and standards, as well as individuals. Short of that, virtually everyone will soon learn just how effective they are. And regardless of their overall effectiveness, the measures can be used to identify those areas of weakness in that particular clinician's practice that can be used to establish a professional development plan. You're going to then incorporate ongoing developments of the new practice into existing practice and policies. Feedback-informed work has already evolved significantly from when it first started back in the year 2000. There are new developments. Example, the study that I cited earlier by De Jong coming out of the Netherlands suggests that it's not so much about the measures, but about the clinicians. So we are really learning a great deal about what it takes to inspire individual clinicians to have fidelity to the measurement and feedback process. It is only during the full implementation phase, according to Fixon, that you should consider adaptations to the intervention, which in this case is feedback. He says that that's the case because if everybody begins to adapt the process early, he has found in his studies that overall there's a greater risk of failure for implementation. Last but not least is sustaining the implementation. In the sustaining phase, practice champions are identified, supported, and used as mentors to others as they come on board. Fit practices are introduced to potential new staff during the hiring and evaluation process. Most training is remedial. I've found in the work that I've done that while you may encounter some difficulties with individual staff members that are already working at the agency, rarely do new hires have problems. New staff are trained to use FIT during the orientation process so that they come on board ready to start. Agency in-service meetings are conducted on specific aspects of FIT practice. This is one thing that Robbie Babbins-Wagner has done remarkably well. Every staff person is given a chance at some point during the year to have a 20-minute lunchtime lecture on some aspect of using feedback-informed practices. That does several things. First off, it makes the knowledge local. Secondly, it reinforces the knowledge of the staff listening to the lecture. But most importantly, it allows individual staff members to review and prepare and solidify information about FIT practice in their minds. This is also a time when tip sheets and facts should be created and used and distributed to staff so that they have easy reference. What does it mean? Let me give you an example. I talk a great deal in my trainings about the clinical cutoff on the ORS. I mention frequently that clients whose scores are above the ORS present certain kinds of challenges with regard to engagement for the therapist. I talk about how to use those scores to engage the client. For example, clients whose scores are high are saying that their lives are relatively good. One potential solution to this is have therapists ask, so why are you here? Most of the time, that person then says, it's because someone else sent me. In which case, my recommendation is to turn the form around and have them fill out the form as if they were the referral source. It's interesting to note that despite saying this in training and on the phone multiple times, when I do consults later on, it's as if I'd never said it at all. Having tip sheets and facts, routine in-service meetings gives people an opportunity to rehearse the information that's important. FIT is a dense process. It requires a shift in perspective, and there's a lot of information in terms of how to do it. Can't expect that the staff will be able to do it following a 2-day training event. These are the 5 stages of implementation. We've broken them into 2 phases. Let me just give you those 2 phases. Number 1 is to have some exposure of the frontline clinicians to the basic ideas and elements of FIT practice. What does that mean? Somebody has to go and hear about FIT and get excited about it. Number 2, and equally important at that same time, as I already said during the preparation phase, is that administration understands the ideas and elements of FIT practice and has vision of and a minimum 3-year commitment to system change. They're willing to support the process. There is a budget in place and a structure in place to facilitate the pilot projects and implementation for up to 3 years. As we said, in the second phase, you're creating a transition oversight group. During that particular time, this group is responsible for fielding the feedback from the bottom-up pilot project, learning what's it going to take to implement these ideas in our particular service setting. Phase 2 is stages 3, 4, and 5. You're going to integrate those pilot project findings into agency policy and procedure. You have that systematic program that includes training, manuals, routine outcome consultation. You develop and standardize that continuum of care for clients that don't seem to fit within your agency, that your therapists just don't seem to help. And clear policies and strategies for ineffective treatment. What's the process for review? Ineffective therapists and ineffective treatment programs. Now, I could go into a specific example at this particular point, but my temptation is, since we've been on this call for a half hour, is to open up to the attendees to ask questions if they would like. And let me just see if I have some of those here. So let me just say, I can unmute people, or you can ask questions via the question box. I'm operating this webinar system myself here, so I'm not exactly an expert at it, but I'm willing to experiment a bit so we can get your questions answered. So if you type any questions into the question box, then I will answer them. The other thing I can do is simply unmute and have people ask questions live if they would like. Let me try that since I'm not getting questions here. Let me just see. I got a few questions. Number one, what would be the downside of skipping the pilot phase and planning for full implementation across all programs and levels right from the beginning? You should plan for implementation across all settings, including your budget. However, you cannot possibly anticipate the strange, small, quirky things that will come up when you start. So we believe that piloting is essential so that you can identify those small, quirky things. Let me give you a crazy example that brought an entire implementation to a standstill, and you're not going to believe it when I say it. I'm called for a consultation, and we explore all the difficulties in that they haven't been using the measures. After spending 30 minutes and discussing, it turns out that there was no one who was in charge of printing the ORS and the SRS. So within several weeks, clinicians had run out of copies of the measures, and they didn't do it after that. These kinds of small things identify elements in the system that virtually no one could identify that end up creating problems. So again, my strong recommendation is that you spend the time to plan it out in the beginning, but make sure that you do a pilot over the course before you start. There's a question from Emma that says that she's fascinated. It takes 7 years to fully implement as a startup, and running on a small lean model. I assume we would avoid the remedial aspect of implementation. With big, well-established teams, surely implementation will take much longer. What about our model of service? It's not me saying this, it's Dean Fixon saying it, but my experience is the same. I was saying 3 years, and again, I would like to promise that it would take less, but my worry about making such promises in two ways. Number one, that feedback is so very effective, and that implementation takes a shorter time, is that we set people up for a fall and people lose momentum as a result. So I would say it's probably not a good idea to think that it's going to take any less time. Plus you're planning. If it takes shorter time, well then what have you really lost? Can we get the PowerPoint? It's a handy summary. Absolutely. The PowerPoints are available on my website and at scottdmiller.com, and the handouts are called Systems Change. Can we talk a little bit about using the ORS and the SRS with groups? I can mention that since most settings actually are delivering an increasing number of services in groups, there is a group session rating scale available when you register to use the measures on my website. You're given that in the packet of measures. There is also information in Manuals 2 and Manuals 5 available on my website for using the measures in group settings. That said, most of the people that I speak with say that they use the measures at the beginning of each group in a way similar to individual care. People simply fill it out, they teach them to score the measures while they're sitting in group, and then they share their outcomes, and outcomes guide the group process. Individual group members can be singled out for attention, much like they would in any group, if they're not doing well. At the end of the group, the SRS is administered. Now, depending on how comfortable your staff are, I love to see therapists process the SRS before people leave. How can you do that? There are several ways. Simply have people raise their hand. Who's scoring 37 and higher? These are the folks that are saying the group went well. Who's scoring 36 and lower? They raise their hand. These are folks that are saying that the group didn't go so well. And then get the two groups to share and discuss. Now, some group member or some group leaders say they're not comfortable with that process, or it hasn't worked out for them. What do you do in such a case? What they have taken to doing, and it's something that I have watched and found helpful, they simply contact the people who score 36 and lower between groups to make sure that they feel okay about returning to groups in the future. Any stats about how successful versus unsuccessful? If I'm reading Dean Fixon's research correctly, it's about 50-50 in terms of full implementation. But remember, those stats vary tremendously depending on the organization. If you have strong administrative buy-in and support, it's virtually 100%. But if you don't, if administration is weak, if funding is under threat, then the chances are, of course, much less. There's also variability between administrators. Sometimes some administrators are simply more effective than others, but there's overall a 50-50 shot. I'm not sure how much that tells us, though. What can you do if you're already 1 year into implementation and things are not going well as planned? I love this question. Welcome to implementation is what I say. They are not likely to go as well as planned. My advice, I have two pieces of advice. The first one is get consultation. Implementation is a challenging and difficult process. So you can do two things. Number one, you can go on the ICCE website, centerforclinicalexcellence.com. There's a forum there for agency implementation. You can post your query. You can use the Ask a Question feature that posts it to the whole site. Post your query there. There are also consultants available on the site. I would love to talk with you about your implementation. Look through the slides and see where are things amiss in the implementation process. Download the FRIFM. And you and management and your members of TOG go through that. There's nothing wrong with a restart. Do I have some facts, FAQs, frequently asked questions during the implementation process? Let me just think about that. I see that's coming from Michael. And I think the key question I get is not even so much a question. What I usually get is, will you come train my staff how to do this? And nowadays I'm taken to unpacking that particular question. My usual response is, what are you looking for? And they say, what do you mean? I want my staff to be able get training in this. I say, well, no, you want your staff to actually be able to use them, to inform policy, to give information to funders, etc. If the answer to those questions are yes, then I say, you don't need me to come first to train your staff. We need to do an hour or two on the phone in a consultation. I'll send you the FRIFM. So I think the main question I get is often this divide between the clinical and the administrative realm. And implementation is the province of administration. If administration is on board, then then you're likely to be successful. Where can you get the FRIFM? There is no cost. Isn't that amazing, to the FRIFM? And if you can't find it on my website, or if the link doesn't work for you, then just send me an email. Info, I-N-F-O, @scottdmiller.com. Can I cite some of the most common barriers to agency implementation? I think one of the most common barriers is the one I just cited. Administration views this as a clinical piece. Number 2 barrier is launching before planning. We think if we get trained in it, it will happen. Number 3, under-resourcing the implementation project. This is going to take time, it's going to take staff, it's going to take money. And if you really want to implement it beyond simply having the staff complete the tools, because they can do that. That's easy. You get people to fill out the measure. But if you want it to affect the process, they will need to have time to reflect. In that regard, please go to my website, again, the publication section, and download an article called The Road to Mastery, and read about the work of Robbie Babbins-Wagner. By the way, you can also contact her via the ICCE website. Would I advise multiple pilots if you're doing therapy programs, clinical programs, versus, say, case management services? And the answer is yes, multiple small pilots. You want as much as possible. There'll be enough complications. So you don't want one staff member from one program and another staff member from an entirely different program together running the pilot. You want the whole program, a circumscribed program, running the pilot within your agency. If that sounds like too much work, then start with one program you feel like you'll be most successful with. I know that seems a bit counterintuitive, but if your clinical team has 10, 15, 20 therapists on staff, then start with that particular group. You can always get to the case managers and case management system within 6 months to a year. So I would do multiple small pilots. The De Jong study is available, and in English. It was in the last issue of the journal called Psychotherapy Research. It is a stunning, interesting finding, and it confirms what I have long believed about feedback, that it is not, now hang with me because we're talking about implementation here, it is not about the measurement tools. It is about therapists being engaged in the process, and that's a whole nother issue and step here. So we've got to get those therapists on board using the measures and affected by it. Let me see if there are any other questions before I call it quits here. I think we've got it, gang. So unless there are any other questions, I'll hang on for just one more minute to see if any other last and final questions come in via the question box. And if not, I want to thank you all for joining me on this webinar, and for your questions and your devotion to taking the work at your agency and the work your clinicians are doing to the next level. I'm very excited about implementing feedback-informed work in various settings. Stand ready to help, as well as the entire ICCE community. Thanks very much. Hope to connect with you soon.